Thank you. I'm Gro Lai from Novo Nordisk, and I would like some perspectives from the FDA on some of the topics that are being heavily debated in EU right now, and that is about events that are not adverse events, but which may or may not need to be data-based, although not expedited. I'm thinking about medication error, off-label use, especially off-label use. What is the FDA perspective to the discussion about sales representatives, any employees, the cleaning lady, to capture that kind of information and have it in the safety database?
Okay.
Very good question, and I think a bunch of these want to respond.
Okay, so part of your question relates to reporting requirements. Part of it would relate to what our inspectors and enforcement might look at as well. First of all, adverse events are adverse events as defined in guidance and regulation. It doesn't matter if it's off-label use or not. That has no bearing on whether you have to report. You have to report an adverse event, whether it's an on-label use or an off-label use. We do have some guidance on long-standing guidance, 10 years or so, on what we call solicited reports. It's not, it's clear-cut as you might like, but basically, if you hear about an adverse event, you have to report it. It doesn't matter who in the company hears about it. If it's an employee of the company or someone who's otherwise an agent of the company, those have to be reported. It doesn't matter if the intent of the reporter was specifically to report an adverse event or it came up in the course of a conversation. A typical example might be a sales representative visiting a physician's office, and in discussing the medicine, the physician happens to mention a patient who had an adverse event. It wasn't the purpose of the interaction, but a representative of the company has heard about an adverse event. It has to be filed and reported as an adverse event. And so that really hasn't changed. So we have a lot of guidance out there, and so we encourage you to look at that.
Okay, John or Bob? Okay. Question at the back.
No, but let me ask Gerald one thing. Doesn't the new periodic reporting require some attention to off-label use? They have to summarize
I think you're talking about the PBER. Again, off-label use, first of all, our regulations require reporting of off-label use. And I believe the PBER requires adverse events from off-label use. I don't believe it requires any information on efficacy from off-label use. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a slight clarification. I was definitely thinking about where there were no adverse event. So you just heard about the drug has been used off-label, but there were no headache, no nothing.
Okay. The fact of off-label use itself doesn't have to be reported. It's the adverse event, and it's the 4 elements needed for the report: the drug, the event, the reporter, and an identifiable, though ideally anonymized, patient who had it. With regard to your question about medication errors, our regulations currently require that adverse events that are a result of medication errors be reported, and that's simply because they are adverse events.
Okay, back microphone.
Good morning, Jean-Louis Sayeux, I'm a consultant. With increased focus on the value of medicines, some governmental agencies are implementing coordinated inputs to drug companies on both the classical regulatory benefit risk assessment aspect of drug development, but also on the pharmacoeconomic HTA evaluation aspect of things. Notably, NICE is involved with MHRA and now EMA in providing joint inputs to companies on their development programs. We briefly discussed this with Bob yesterday, suggested that I ask the question to this panel. Is there any plans, any system right now in place for coordination of input from FDA and CMS, for example, or any future plans to do so?
Well, since Bob prompted the question, I guess he wants me to answer it.
Absolutely. John, I didn't know whether, I know we have permission to have meetings with CMS, but I couldn't remember any that Ode 1 had, and I thought maybe you'd know if we're having more of them than I know.
I'm not aware of any specific program in CDER for planned interactions between CMS and FDA and the company during drug development. We have an information sharing agreement with CMS, so we can interact with them, and we occasionally do, but it's not a routine part of our business model. So I can't recall any situation where we've had like an end of phase 2 meeting where CMS was at the table as well to talk about pharmacoeconomics. That's not part of our remit. It's not part of what we do. So we work with them on some issues, but it's not part of the normal course of business.
Thank you.
But it is worth noting that if somebody wanted to develop data to support a comparative claim, some of which could go in labeling if it was strong enough, we would be happy to talk to people about how to design studies that could do that. And one of our systematic worries is that people will use data that don't really support comparisons to make public comparisons, so we wouldn't like that much. So we would love to talk about study designs that are capable of doing that.
Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name's Andy Rankin. I'm from Prescient Healthcare Group in New Jersey. And I think it's a question probably for Drs. Jenkins and Temple. Now, I've been involved in biosimilar development for a number of years and continue to be. I know the guidelines are draft at this stage, but I was wondering on your views on two hot items for biosimilars, and that is naming criteria in the first place and indication extrapolation. Good luck.
Thank you.
I send the easy ones over to John.
Okay.
Well, I'll take the second one first because that's easier. We're continuing to meet with companies and provide advice about biosimilars. We have a very active program. We have a biosimilars review committee that meets on a weekly basis to review programs. We're starting to see now programs that have advanced to the stage where we're actually seeing data coming in instead of just hypothetical plans to compare the biosimilar to the innovator. We're actually now starting to see data coming in for the analytic comparisons, some PK comparisons, even some clinical comparisons. So we're seeing that. I think your question is, what's the position on when do you get an interchangeable rating versus when do you get a biosimilar rating? That's something I think we're still working on internally. The statute has very different criteria for what a biosimilar approval is versus what an interchangeable biosimilar approval is. We have not opined in guidance yet in detail on what the criteria might be for interchangeability. It's a provision under the law, but it's a very complicated one.
I was also thinking of the, if you've got RA and NHL,
right?
The extrapolation.
For extrapolation, the law allows the biosimilar to seek one or more of the approved indications, and it also allows the agency to extrapolate. So we have been giving companies advice that we're open to extrapolation as we weigh the totality of the evidence. We ask them to make the case for why we should extrapolate from the example you gave. If they studied RA and we conclude they're highly similar, biosimilar to the innovator in RA, why should we extrapolate that to lymphoma or some other indication? So we're open to that, but it's always going to be based on the data and the science and what do we know about the mechanism of action of the drug in one disease versus another. So we've been giving that advice pretty consistently to companies on extrapolation. Your first question went to naming, and I'm going to look to my associate director for biosimilars, and I don't think we've announced an official position on biosimilar naming, so I'm not going to do that here.
Dodging the bullets. Thank you.
That's one thing. This isn't the place to set policy.